My brother Richard and his wife Patricia forged our father's will and stole our family's $7.2 million estate. The 3 houses, the antique shop, the land in Bend, everything that belonged to all of us. At 67 years old, I found myself living in a studio apartment with nothing but a few boxes and the clothes on my back. My own daughters believed their uncle over me. The lawyers said I had no case. But then I remembered something my mother whispered to me 2 weeks before she passed. Your father kept a storage unit, Unit 42 at Columbia Self-Storage. He never told Richard about it. I drove there with my last $20 in gas money. When I opened that rusted metal door, what I found inside didn't just give me back what I'd lost. It gave me the power to expose the truth and watch my brother's perfect life crumble exactly the way mine had. But you need to understand who I was before all of this. You need to see the family I believed in, the life I built, and the love I thought was unbreakable. Because only then will you understand why what I discovered in that storage unit wasn't just about money. It was about justice that had been waiting 30 years to be served. My name is Margaret Chen, but everyone calls me Maggie. I spent 42 years as a librarian at Multnomah County Library in Portland, Oregon. It wasn't glamorous work, but I loved it. I loved the smell of old books, the quiet conversations, helping people find exactly what they were looking for. I retired 3 years ago at 64, planning to spend my time gardening, reading, and enjoying the life my parents had worked so hard to build for us. My father, William Chen, immigrated from Taiwan in 1958 with $17 and a $17 and an engineering degree nobody in America wanted to recognize. He worked 3 jobs, saved every penny, and slowly built something remarkable. First, he bought a small house in southeast Portland, then another, then a commercial building on Hawthorne where he opened an antique shop. By the time I was born in 1957, he owned 3 properties. By the time he died last year at 93, those 3 properties were worth millions. Dad always told us the plan was simple. When he passed, everything would be split equally between me and my older brother Richard, 50-50. He said it at every holiday dinner, every birthday, every family gathering. Your mother and I built this for both of you. It will be shared equally. Always. Richard is 3 years older than me. Growing up, we were close. He protected me in school, taught me to ride a bike, scared away my first boyfriend when the kid turned out to be a jerk. He became a real estate developer, married Patricia when I was 25, and they had 1 son, David. I married Tom, a high school history teacher, and we had 2 daughters, Emily and Grace. For 40 years, our families celebrated holidays together. Our kids grew up like siblings. But something changed in Richard after Dad's stroke 5 years ago. Dad survived, but his mind was never quite the same. He could still talk, still recognize us, but he got confused easily. Dates mixed up. Names forgotten. He'd tell the same story 3 times in one conversation. That's when Patricia started suggesting that maybe Dad needed someone to help manage his affairs. Someone with business experience. Someone like Richard. I didn't see the trap being set. Patricia had always been different from the rest of us. Where our family was quiet and humble, she was loud and flashy. She wore designer clothes to family dinners. She talked constantly about their European vacations and their second home in Scottsdale. She made little comments about my sensible Toyota. Your car still running, Maggie? We just traded in Richard's Mercedes for the new model. It stings more comfortable. I brushed it off as her just being Patricia. Tacky but harmless. I was so wrong. Mom died 2 years ago. Lung cancer. It happened fast. 3 months from diagnosis to funeral. In her last weeks, she was in and out of consciousness. But one afternoon when I was sitting alone with her in the hospice room, she grabbed my hand with surprising strength. Her eyes were clear for the first time in days. Maggie. Her voice was barely a whisper. Your father's storage unit, Unit 42, Columbia Self-Storage on Sandy Boulevard. He kept papers there, important papers. Don't tell Richard. Promise me. I promised. But I didn't understand. Mom, what papers? Why can't Richard know? She squeezed my hand tighter. Your father knew. He saw how Richard changed, how Patricia changed him. The unit, remember, 42. Then the morphine pulled her back under, and she never spoke clearly again. She died 3 days later. In the chaos of the funeral and grief, I forgot about the storage unit. I figured Mom's mind was slipping, mixing up memories. Dad had always been so open about his properties, his assets. Why would he keep a storage unit secret? I should have listened to her immediately. That mistake cost me everything. Dad lived another year after Mom passed. Richard and Patricia visited him constantly. I was there too, of course, bringing him his favorite foods, reading to him, making sure he was comfortable in the nursing home. But I noticed Richard and Patricia always asked the staff for private time with Dad. They'd close the door to his room for an hour, sometimes 2. When I asked what they talked about, Richard would smile and say, just reminiscing about old times. You know how Dad loves his stories. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was my brother. Dad passed away on a Tuesday morning in March last year, peaceful, in his sleep. The nursing home called me first, since I was listed as primary contact. I called Richard immediately. We cried together on the phone. We planned the funeral together. We sorted through Dad's room at the nursing home together. Everything felt right, united in grief, just like family should be. The reading of the will was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral. Dad's lawyer, Martin Fitzgerald, had been with our family for 30 years. He'd drawn up Mom and Dad's wills, handled property transactions, witnessed every major legal moment of their lives. When I walked into his office for the reading, I felt sad but also strangely comforted. This was the last thing Dad had planned for us, his final act of love, making sure we were both taken care of. Richard and Patricia were already there. Patricia wore all black like she was the grieving daughter. Richard looked somber. My daughters, Emily and Grace, came with me for support. Richard's son, David, sat beside his parents. Martin looked uncomfortable. I remember noticing that. The way his eyes didn't quite meet mine when I walked in. He cleared his throat and opened a folder. This is the last will and testament of William Chen, dated November 8th, 2023. My stomach dropped. November 2023? That was only 4 months ago. Dad's dementia was severe by then. He could barely remember what he'd had for breakfast. How could he have drafted a new will? Martin began reading. The words felt like punches. I bequeath to my son Richard Chen the following: the house on Southeast Stark Street, the house on Northeast Broadway, the commercial property on Hawthorne Boulevard, the 20 acres of undeveloped land in Bend, all assets held in accounts at Wells Fargo Bank, all stocks, bonds, and securities. I waited for my name, waited to hear, and to my daughter Margaret. But it never came. Martin continued. To my daughter Margaret Chen, I leave my personal effects, photographs, and the sum of $5,000 as a token of my appreciation for her occasional visits. Occasional visits? I was there 3 times a week. I was the one who held his hand through every doctor's appointment. I was the one who stayed overnight when he had pneumonia. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't process what I'd just heard. $5,000. Not even enough to cover the funeral costs I'd already paid. The room tilted. I gripped the arms of my chair. That can't be right. My voice sounded strange, distant. Dad always said everything would be split equally. Always. For my entire life. He said 50-50. Richard's face was a mask of false sympathy. I'm sorry, Maggie. I know this is hard. But Dad's wishes were clear. Maybe in his final months, he realized who was really there for him. Who was really there? I was there constantly. Patricia touched Richard's arm, a gesture of support, but I saw something else in her face. Satisfaction. This is what Dad wanted, she said softly. We have to respect his choices. Emily stood up. Her voice shook with anger. This is insane. Grandpa would never do this. We all heard him say 50-50 a million times. Uncle Richard, you know this isn't right. Richard stood too. I understand you're upset, but the law is clear. This is Dad's will. It's signed. It's legal. There's nothing to contest. Martin looked at me. His discomfort had turned to pity. Margaret, I know this is shocking. If you'd like to review the document, you're entitled to a copy. If you believe there are grounds to contest, you could consult another attorney. I took the copy home. I read it 100 times. The signature looked like Dad's shaky, late-stage handwriting. The witnesses were people I didn't recognize. Later I learned they were Patricia's friends. Later I learned so many things I wish I'd known sooner. I hired a lawyer. Not a fancy one. I couldn't afford that. I found Ellen Morrison through the State Bar website. She was 62, semi-retired, working out of a small office above a pizza place. But she'd been practicing for 35 years, and she listened to my story with the sharp attention of someone who'd seen every kind of family betrayal. "Margaret," she said after I finished, "this smells wrong. The timing, the disinheritance, the witnesses being your sister-in-law's friends. But here's the hard truth. Contesting a will is expensive, tens of thousands of dollars, and it's hard to win. We'd need to prove your father lacked mental capacity when he signed it, or that he was under undue influence. I don't have tens of thousands of dollars." "I know." Ellen leaned back in her chair. "Do you have any evidence? Any documents showing your father's earlier intentions? Any witnesses to conversations about how he wanted things split? Just 40 years of him saying it would be equal. Just family dinners where everyone heard it. But people's memories become unreliable in court, especially when my brother is on the other side. What about the daughters, Emily and Grace? Would they testify?" I thought about my girls. Emily was 38, a nurse with 2 kids. Grace was 35, teaching middle school art. They were furious on my behalf, but they had their own lives, their own families to protect. And their cousin David had already sent them threatening messages. "If you testify against my parents, you'll regret it. Consider yourselves cut off." "I don't want to drag them into this," I told Ellen. "Richard and Patricia have money for years of legal battles. I have my pension and Social Security. I can't fight this." Ellen nodded slowly. "Then I'm sorry, Margaret. Without funding and without evidence, we don't have a case." I left her office and drove home to the studio apartment I'd rented with my last savings. It was 400 square feet. 1 room with a Murphy bed, a kitchenette the size of a closet, and a bathroom where you had to turn sideways to close the door. This was my life now. At 67, I was starting over from nothing while my brother lived in luxury built on our father's work, our father's legacy, half of which should have been mine. The next 6 months were the darkest of my life. I applied for part-time work, but nobody wants to hire a 67-year-old former librarian. I lived on $1,500 a month from Social Security. I ate pasta and canned vegetables. I stopped going to my book club because I couldn't afford the coffee shop where we met. I canceled my phone and used the library's computer for email. Worst of all was losing my daughters. Not physically. They still called, still visited. But Richard had started working on them. He'd invite them to expensive dinners at his house. He'd give their kids lavish birthday gifts. He'd make comments. "Your mother is struggling because she never planned well. I tried to help her, but she's stubborn. Too proud to accept family support." "It's sad, really." Emily called me one night. Her voice was careful. "Mom, Uncle Richard said he'd offered to give you money from the estate and you refused." "Is that true?" "He never offered me anything." "He says he did. He says you're telling people he forged the will and it's hurting his reputation. He says if you keep spreading lies, he'll have to sue you for defamation." I closed my eyes. The trap was complete. Richard controlled the narrative. He had the money, the status, the respectability. I was just the bitter sister who couldn't accept Dad's final wishes. "Emily." I kept my voice steady. "I know how this looks. I know Uncle Richard seems believable. But I'm telling you the truth. Your grandfather wanted everything split equally. That will is wrong. I know it in my bones." Silence. "Then, Mom, I love you. But maybe you should stop focusing on what you lost and start figuring out how to move forward. This fight is destroying you." After we hung up, I cried for 3 hours. My own daughter thought I was delusional, unable to move on. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was broken by grief and couldn't see reality. But then I remembered Mom's words. The storage unit. Unit 42. Columbia Self-Storage. I'd forgotten. In the chaos and pain of the last 6 months, I'd completely forgotten her dying wish. The next morning, I took the bus to Columbia Self-Storage on Sandy Boulevard. It was an old facility, one of those orange metal buildings from the 1980s. The office smelled like cigarettes and motor oil. A woman in her 50s sat behind a counter doing a crossword puzzle. "I'm looking for information about Unit 42. My father, William Chen, may have rented it." She typed on an ancient computer. Yep, William Chen. Unit 42. Been renting since 1993, paid through the end of this year. You got a key? No. He passed away. I'm his daughter. I can show you the death certificate. She barely glanced at it. Close enough. She handed me a key on a plastic tag. Units on the second floor. Elevator's broken, so you gotta take the stairs. If there's anything valuable, you gotta clear it out by December or we auction it off. I climbed the metal stairs. My knees ached. The hallway was dim and smelled of dust and old cardboard. Unit 42 was at the far end. I put the key in the lock, and it turned with a click that echoed. The door rolled up with a screech of metal on metal. Afternoon light filtered through a grimy window. And there, filling a 10 by 10 space, was my father's secret. Dozens of cardboard boxes, neatly stacked, labeled in Dad's precise handwriting. Original will, property deeds, financial records, personal correspondence, and in the back corner, something unexpected. A collection of wooden crates labeled Rare Books, Handle with Care. My hands shook as I opened the first box. Inside was a document. Last Will and Testament of William Chen. Dated April 5th, 2010. I scanned it quickly. I bequeath to my son, Richard Chen, and to my daughter, Margaret Chen, in equal shares, all property, assets, and holdings. 50-50, exactly as he'd always said. I pulled out my phone, took photos of every page. Then I opened the next box, more legal documents, but also letters, dozens of letters in Dad's handwriting, all addressed to me but never sent. Written over the course of years. I opened one dated 3 years ago. My dearest Maggie. I know Richard has been pressuring me to change my will. Patricia came again today with her lawyer friend. They speak to me like I'm stupid, like I don't understand what they're trying to do. I played along. I signed their papers with my left hand so the signature would look wrong. I let them think they succeeded, but I want you to know the truth. Everything I built is for both of you equally. This storage unit contains the proof. Your mother knows. When the time comes, she'll tell you. I'm sorry you'll have to fight for what's rightfully yours, but I know you have the strength. You always did. Love, Dad. I sat down hard on the concrete floor. He knew. He knew Richard was going to betray me, and he'd prepared for it. All those private meetings weren't reminiscing. They were Patricia and Richard forging documents while Dad played confused. He'd protected me the only way he could. I opened more boxes. Found property deeds with both our names. Found bank statements showing Dad had moved money into a trust account Richard knew nothing about. Found photographs. Found correspondence with Martin Fitzgerald from 2010 showing the original will was filed officially. And then I opened the crates in the back. Rare books, first editions. Dad had been collecting them my entire life, quietly. A Hemingway first edition, an original Steinbeck, a signed copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. He'd never shown anyone, never mentioned them. I later learned why. These books were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The entire collection, professionally appraised 6 months later, came to over $52 million. My father, the humble immigrant who worked 3 jobs and saved every penny, had built not one fortune but 2, and he'd hidden the second one where Richard would never think to look. I called Ellen Morrison from the storage unit. Ellen, I found evidence. I found everything. My father's original will, letters explaining what Richard did, financial documents, and I found something else, something worth a lot of money, enough to fund the biggest legal fight Richard has ever seen. There was a pause. How much money, Margaret? Over $50 million in rare books that weren't included in the estate because nobody knew they existed. Ellen's laugh was sharp and delighted. Oh, this just got very interesting. Don't touch anything else. I'm calling a probate specialist, and we're going to bury your brother so deep he'll never see daylight again. The next 6 months were a completely different kind of battle. This time, I had resources. Ellen brought in Marcus Webb, a probate litigator who'd won cases against some of the biggest firms in Portland. We cataloged everything in the storage unit, had the books professionally appraised, had handwriting experts examine both wills, had medical experts review Dad's capacity at the time of the forged will. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Richard and Patricia had exploited a 92-year-old man with dementia to steal his estate. We filed a motion to set aside the fraudulent will. Richard hired a firm with 12 lawyers. They fought us on every detail. They claimed the storage unit was planted evidence. They claimed the books were worthless. They claimed Dad had mental capacity. They threw every legal obstacle they could. But we had something they didn't. The truth. And $52 million to make sure the truth came out. The hearing took place 10 months after I'd opened that storage unit. The courtroom was packed. My daughters sat behind me. They'd come around once they saw the evidence. Once they understood their uncle had lied to everyone. Richard and Patricia sat across the aisle. Patricia's designer clothes and perfect hair couldn't hide the tension in her face. Richard wouldn't look at me. The judge was a stern woman in her 60s named Linda Warren. She'd reviewed all our evidence in advance. When our handwriting expert testified that the November 2023 will showed signs of forgery, Richard's lawyer tried to object. Judge Warren shut him down. When the medical expert explained that Dad's dementia made it impossible for him to have understood complex legal documents in his final months, Patricia whispered something angry to Richard. And when Marcus Webb presented Dad's letters, reading aloud the parts where Dad described Richard's manipulation, the courtroom went silent. Judge Warren made her ruling after 3 days of testimony. It is the finding of this court that the will dated November 2023 was procured through fraud and undue influence. It is hereby set aside. The will dated April 2010 is reinstated as the valid last will and testament of William Chen. Furthermore, this court finds that Richard Chen and Patricia Chen knowingly participated in elder abuse and financial exploitation. The matter is being referred to the district attorney for potential criminal charges. Richard stood up. His face was red. "This is insane. You have no proof. My father wanted me to have everything," he told me. Judge Warren's voice was ice. "Mr. Chen, your father left a storage unit full of proof that you're a liar. Sit down or I'll hold you in contempt." Patricia grabbed Richard's arm and pulled him back down. Her perfect composure finally cracked. Tears ran down her face, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage at being caught. The estate was redistributed. $3.6 million to me. $3.6 million to Richard. The rare book collection, legally separate from the estate, went entirely to me since Dad had documented it as a private collection. Richard and Patricia faced criminal charges for elder abuse and fraud. They accepted a plea deal. No jail time, but 5 years probation and a permanent record. My daughters apologized. We had a long talk about how Richard had manipulated them, how they'd wanted to believe family could never be that cruel. We're rebuilding trust slowly. It's not perfect, but it's real. I sold the rare book collection to a museum, kept 3 books that had been Dad's favorites, used the money to start something Dad would have loved. A foundation providing free legal aid to elderly people fighting financial exploitation by family members. Named it the William and Helen Chen Justice Fund. Last month I got a letter from Richard. It came to the foundation's address somehow. I almost threw it away, but curiosity won. The letter said he was sorry, that Patricia had pushed him into it, that he'd convinced himself Dad really wanted him to have everything, that he'd justified it as being owed for all the years he'd worked in real estate while I'd just been a librarian. He asked if we could ever be family again. I wrote back. 1 sentence. "You stopped being my brother the day you looked at our father's dementia and saw an opportunity instead of a tragedy." I haven't heard from him since. I'm 68 now. I live in a comfortable condo with a view of Mount Hood. I volunteer at the library again. I have lunch with my daughters every Sunday. I funded college accounts for all 4 of my grandchildren. And every day, I get letters at the foundation from elderly people who need help fighting their own Richards and Patricias. Each case we win feels like honoring Dad's memory. Each family we keep together feels like justice served one more time. Because the real inheritance Dad left me wasn't the money or the property or even the rare books. It was the lesson that truth might take time, but it always finds a way to surface if you're patient enough to wait for it. The storage unit is empty now. I cleared it out completely, but before I turned in the key, I stood in that space one last time. Imagine Dad carefully packing boxes, writing letters he hoped I'd never need but preparing them just in case, loving me enough to protect me even after death. "Thank you," I whispered to the empty unit. Thank you for seeing what was coming. Thank you for trusting me to be strong enough to fight. Thank you for teaching me that family is about integrity, not blood. And then I locked the door and walked away. Because sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give isn't wealth. It's the tools to protect yourself when the people who should love you most choose greed instead. Did you like my story? Let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. And if this resonated with you, send a super thanks to support more true stories like this. Thank you for listening.